So here's our next screencast about free trade and the benefits and drawbacks of free trade. Those first two prompts we're just going to skip by quickly. So the benefits of free trade, we've talked about these quite a bit, which is sort of a screencast that you can watch to pull ideas together. Remember that we did say that graphical analysis is certainly part of any economics inquiry into free trade. We've just chosen not to do graphical analysis for this unit. It doesn't mean it can't be done. It's just that we're not doing it. So first thing is that free trade allows for specialization of resources, increasing a nation's output. What this means is that in any country, in any economy, because you can now buy needed product from abroad, you don't have to make them yourself. So for example, America does not spend a tremendous amount of energy making textiles because it can be bought from abroad. So America can spend more energy and time on those things it does best, high-end manufacturing like automobiles and jet engines and that sort of thing. Specialization of resources. All resources can be put to those things for which America has the most powerful comparative advantage to other countries. Other countries can do exactly the same thing. It increases competition. When you have to now compete in a global marketplace, you have much less monopoly power. This is a good thing for all economies. Remember, monopolies they're not awful, but often they're not good for consumers. It leads to a greater efficiency of resource use. In other words, natural resources get used more efficiently because the competition of the global marketplace demands efficiency in all production, including and especially with resources. An economy of scale is when you're able to produce on mass quantities of your product, and you may be able to achieve that economy of scale because not only do you have now access to resource markets that may allow you to buy tremendous amounts of resources, but also because you have huge product markets. Getting big, in other words, growing your company big, might make sense. And when you have economies of scale, resources, you can bargain cheaper prices for resources. For example, Starbucks has something like 18,000 stores worldwide. Starbucks can bargain for very low prices on coffee because they're so big. Low prices on the coffee keeps their costs down, keeps prices for consumers low. Domestic firms can have access to necessary resources for growth. It means that a company might be able to purchase the things that it needs to grow from abroad. They don't have to build them themselves or have a hard time buying them domestically if indeed the domestic sector is small or doesn't exist at all. It may be the case that, for example, you might want to try to build cellular networks in your country. You can purchase the technology from abroad. Technology and ideas themselves get spread about. Every time you sell a computer abroad, you sell not only that computer, but all the things that that computer can build for you. So that's a good thing for developing economies, especially. And it stimulates growth. Free trade brings about growing economies. It's very rare that free trade does not create growth for all economies involved. Growth does not equal development. Remember, an economy that's bigger is not one that's better or fairer, but it's really hard to get better or fairer unless you get bigger. And this is something we've alluded to already. Consumers have more choices at lower prices, which is a good thing. However, there are a lot of drawbacks to free trade. One is that you have the problem of getting foreign producers to comply with anti-dumping regulations. Remember, dumping is when you sell something below cost in order to kill off competition. This is a real problem. And from time to time, American politicians accuse Chinese manufacturers of dumping their products onto American markets. Employment is hurt. It's not just that it may hurt employment, it almost certainly does hurt employment. The key is the net effect on employment. If people lose their jobs in one industry, do they find good paying jobs in another, maybe new industry? It may create dependencies. Economies may become dependent on each other. You go from a healthy relationship to a dependent relationship. Some countries are dependent on others for food. The US is dependent on certain economies for fuel. This might be negative things because it might force you to be in relationships with nations that you might otherwise want to You might otherwise want those relationships to have a different character. May create financial problems. Maybe a developing country is buying lots and lots of technology from abroad, and this is great, but it results in a net outflow of currency, so the country becomes impoverished as far as currency goes. Or they maybe take out enormous loans to buy all of this technology and struggle to pay it back. This is certainly an issue all across sub-Saharan Africa. Culture could be diluted. Let's say that, just for the sake of argument, if American goods and services become the de facto standard for the globe, then people might, in other countries, might worry that their cultures are becoming too Americanized. It also could really expand and enrich cultures as you're able to buy products from abroad, but diluting culture is certainly an issue, including and especially culture around expectations of what work is like. Some of the criticisms that you may hear of free trade is that it makes all work days an American work day. A lot of other countries around the world do not necessarily feel that the American way of working is the way that they want to work. Americans work too many hours, too many days of the week, and they are worried that of that being imposed on their economy. And as Robert Reich said, it encourages a race to the bottom. Free trade allows for producers to find the location on earth where production is the cheapest, and therefore it keeps wages low and resource prices low, pushing down wages and resource prices all over the place. It's not that it brings up wages in developing countries so much as it pulls wages down in developed countries. And this is a bit of an overgeneralization, but the bottom 3/5 of American workers have seen no increase in income after adjusting for inflation over the last 35 years. Many countries like to use a series of moves that we call, that we might group into this heading we call protectionism. Tariffs, quotas, and subsidies. You might tax to limit sales of a particular product. You might simply just set a quota. You may not import any more than this number, or subsidize domestic industries to compete with lower priced foreign products. You might do this to protect jobs. You might do this to protect industries that you'd really like to develop that are not yet developed. An example of this is the solar industry in America. The Obama administration has wanted very much to subsidize solar production to protect this against competition from Chinese solar manufacturers. You might use protectionism to put an embargo or to put pressure on another country. Maybe sanctions, such as the sanctions against Iran pre-nuclear deal. So what are free trade agreements around the world? Well, a sampling of them, the WTO, World Trade Organization. Remember that the World Trade Organization is not a free trade agreement in and of itself. It's not a free trade zone in and of itself, but rather it's an agreement among the member nations to say we will look to find and write free trade agreements wherever possible. So it's kind of an agreement to make agreements. It's the rules to make rules. It's the World Trade Organization. 152 countries are involved. The EU, the European Union, of course, right now is the biggest free trade zone in the world. We've talked about this. You could travel across the EU with one passport. Most of the countries use one currency. There's no restrictions really to speak of on trade. In fact, if I am, say, of German birth with a German passport, I can work in France without even needing to get a work visa. Very, very, very minimalized barriers to free trade. NAFTA, which is North American Free Trade Agreement, Canada, Mexico, and the United States. This has been in effect for about 23 years. It would go away if the TPP is ratified and replaces it. The Trans-Pacific Partnership includes these 12 member nations, a really interesting mix of countries, the wealthiest country on earth and some of the least wealthy countries on earth. Noticeable because of the absence of China, and we talked a lot about what that means for the agreement. And then finally, some final summative thoughts about free trade is that the benefits of free trade are spread out, but costs are not. What we mean by this is that when free trade agreements are entered into by countries, lots and lots of people benefit a little bit, say lower prices, but many people are hurt quite badly, say losing their job. Free trade is a political issue as much as an economic one. That's certainly true. Sometimes the benefits of free trade free trade agreements might benefit people in other countries more than in your own country, a reason not to necessarily support it. That's certainly a feeling of the TPP by many politicians. Displaced markets have time to recover, but displaced workers may not. So a free trade agreement might lead to outsourcing in a particular industry. That industry in and of itself might recover, but it might take 10 years. In the meantime, displaced workers are going to be feeling significant pain. A huge criticism has been that free trade agreements are negotiated in private. They're not subject to the same public scrutiny that, say, the legislative process in Congress is. Free trade agreements are negotiated without any room for comment by the TPP. Nobody knew really what was happening in the TPP until it was agreed to. Now, Congress will hold hearings before it ratifies it, but it's still, in democracies, we appreciate transparency and accountability in the free trade agreements, and many believe, and Robert Reich especially, that there's no real accountability for the TPP. There's long been a concern that free trade agreements allow wealthy nations to bully poorer nations into accepting terms they might rather not. But if you are Vietnam, do you want to lose America's business? You can't. You can't afford not to be in business with America. So they kind of have to take the deal that America offers. That's speculation. That's not necessarily a fact. That's opinion. Keep that in mind as you work, that that's an opinion. Many economists hold that opinion, though. Free trade agreements can help promote human rights. That's almost the very first thing we said in the unit. And free trade agreements don't yet really address climate change. They almost kind of haven't talked about it really in any substantial way at all. So anyway, that's a very quick summary overview of free trade.